teaching text for today comes from Mark 5. It's the story of the demoniac, but I just picked a portion of it that we're going to reference. But if you're familiar with Mark 5 at all, Jesus goes into the lands of the Gadarenes and sees this man that has a legion of demons, and he casts him out. And that's where the story kind of picks up. So Mark 5, verses 18 through 20. Mark writes, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. And Jesus did not let him go, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And so the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. This is the word of the Lord. Shortly after I became a Christian, I wanted to try and figure out how to share my faith in a compelling way like this man, where the response was everyone was amazed when he shared his story. I wanted to figure out how to share my faith in that way. And so I joined this course of how to share your faith, and you would go through the course and then do practical stuff like go door to door. It was old school, go door to door, knock on the doors and ask the people if they wanted to know Jesus. And it was great, actually. I really loved it, and it taught me a ton. But one of the stories in the process, I don't know if it was folklore or it was a real story, but they tell this story of this man that was in the process of the class and learning how to do the class and all the rest. And his first time out to walk up on the steps, knock on the door, talk to people about Jesus and share his faith. What he did. And so what he did was he walked up on the steps, knocked on the door. He told the other person with him, I'll take this one. I was like, great, love the passion. And knocked on the door. The man opened the door, and the guy introduces himself hey, we're from so-and-so church, whatever, and shook the man's hand. And as he shook the man's hand, his other hand reaches in his pocket, grabs a lighter, and lights it underneath the man's hand, and is like, do you like how that feels? And it's like, this is where you're going. This is your experience forever if you don't turn and follow Jesus. So, would you like to turn and follow Jesus? And again, who knows? Nowadays you'd be sued or killed. I'm not sure. But maybe in the 70s it was it's pretty normal. I didn't live during the 70s. But the story, whether it's true or not, it was held up in this class as this is the archetype. Don't do that. But this is the passion and the urgency that we need. We have to tell people of the truth of hell and help them understand this is a real place that you're going to, and this is where you're going. And that was basically the impetus of sharing our faith the entire time. And so in my experience with Christians, and especially in that class, if you were to ask somebody, share the good news with me, tell me what you believe the good news is, in my experience, primarily, this is what people would say. They would say something along the lines of, you're going to hell. It's a strong start. Here's the good news. You're going to hell. Because you're a sinner, but Jesus died to pay the penalty for your sin, and if you believe in him, you won't go to hell. Now, I believe all of that is true. My issue, where I take issue with that, and one of the most significant ones, is the most compelling reason in that good news. One of the most compelling reasons to follow Jesus is not Jesus himself. It's to avoid hell. And so they're not really speaking good news of Jesus. They're actually just telling you bad news of hell. And so they're going about it the opposite way. The second reason I find issue with that, and again, it's not that it's untrue, is it's not how you see people testify in the Bible about Jesus and share their good news of him. That's not how they do it. And so the man that we just read about, he didn't run into the Decapolis and you're all going to burn. He didn't light people's hands on fire or anything like that. He started testifying to the mercy that God had shown him. And so what I want to do today is I want to just show you how people talked about Jesus in the Gospels, and how people talked about him, and then what that means for us as people who hopefully want to share the good news of Jesus in a compelling way. And then I just want to give you some practical ways to do that. And so those two things. Look at how they shared in the Gospels, and then what that means for us and how we can actually do that. So first, here's how people, just look at how people share their good news in the Bible. So just kind of doing a run through. John 4, woman at the well. If you're familiar with the story, Jesus comes to this woman. She's a Samaritan woman. Woman at the well, this is her good news. This is what she runs back into town saying. She says, come see the man who told me everything I ever did. Come see the man who told me everything I ever did. And what this meant was, even though I'm an outsider, even though I'm a Samaritan, and even though this man knows everything about me and all the disgusting garbage stuff about me, he knows everything and everything I've done. He hasn't rejected me, he's accepted me. He knows me completely and still wants a relationship with me. And so she runs back into town telling everybody, come see the man that knows everything about me and hasn't rejected me the way that you guys have. Come see that man. And then notice the outcome, verse 39 of John 4, it says, many Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. Notice, no mention of hell. No lighting anyone on fire. Or it's going pretty well so far. She's just announcing the kindness that she's experienced from Jesus, and people believe in him based on that story and then come to follow him for themselves. John 9, the man born blind, they ask him, how are your eyes opened? And he replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed, and then I could see. One thing I know, I was blind, but now I see. The simple story of like, I was blind, now I see. They start asking him a ton of questions. What about this? What about that? Like, look, I don't know anything about any of that. I don't know anything about the law, or I don't know. All I know is I was blind, now I see. This is the testimony. The demoniac in Mark 5, again, Jesus, we read that text. Jesus says, go home to your own people. Tell them the mercy that God had on you and what he has done for you. And so it says that he goes and does that, and the people are amazed. And you have to imagine what his story was, because we don't actually know exactly what he said. But it's something along the lines of, like, I was tormented by thousands of demons. Like, y'all remember me. You remember what I was like. Chains couldn't bind me. I was separated from my family. I was alone in the dark. I was cutting myself. I mean, there was darkness surrounding me completely, and I was completely alone. And this man came for me and for me alone into this space where Jews aren't supposed to go, and he healed me and he set me free. And he just runs into town and he's telling that story. And then if you follow this story, if you follow that Mark 5 story, the demoniac story, and follow it all the way through to Mark 7, you see that Jesus left that area where the demoniac was. But then in Mark 7, he goes back. He goes into the Decapolis again. And if you remember in Mark 5, the people, when the demoniac is healed, what happens? They beg Jesus, they beg him, get out. We want nothing to do with you. Please, we don't know who you are. You're very powerful, very good job. Get out. We don't know you. Please leave. But then in Mark 7, notice what it says when Jesus goes back to that same area. It says, Jesus went into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hands on him. 2 chapters later, Mark 5, we're begging you to leave. Please we want nothing to do with you. Mark 7, please don't leave. We want everything to do with you. And the only thing that stood in the gap between get out of here, we hate you, and please stay, we love you, is this man's story just testifying to the goodness that he experienced with Jesus. We want you to leave, and now please don't leave. We want you to stay. Even beyond the testimonies that we actually see in the scriptures, if you just look at some of the stories and the encounters that Jesus has with people, you can look at their story and probably just infer what they would have said, what their good news would have been. If people would have asked them, like, what was so good about Jesus? I think you can kind of look at their story and go, they probably would have said something like this. And so, for instance, the woman caught in adultery, what she probably said if they were like, what was so great about this man, Jesus, that you encountered in John 8? She probably mentioned nothing of hell. She probably said a lot about, like, I was caught in my sin, and they were about to kill me, and all Jesus had to do was say the word, and then I would be dead. But he didn't condemn me. He had mercy on me. He forgave me, and he actually he defended me. He kept me from being killed by these people. And I was caught in my sin. I deserved everything that they were talking about, and he chose to forgive me and not condemn me instead. And that would have been her good news. That would have been what she shared. Mary Magdalene, Luke 8:2 says that Mary Magdalene, of whom 7 demons were driven out of, her good news was probably something along the line, like, why do you follow Jesus? Why do you like him? It's like, well, because I was stuck in darkness. I had all of these issues with me, and like I just couldn't get set free. And then all of a sudden I met this man, and Jesus drove all of that darkness out of my life. And now I'm free from that stuff. The woman with the issue of blood in Mark 5. We know that she probably shared her story pretty consistently because it's written down, because she told what happened. But the idea is, like, she probably went around saying, like, for 12 years I was in suffering. And then all of a sudden I meet this man, and I had given all my money to doctors, and I had just gotten worse and worse and worse. But then all of a sudden I meet this man, and all I wanted to do was touch the hem of his cloak. If I could just touch the edge of his cloak, then I'd be well. And then it happened for me. And that's probably what she went and told everybody, because again, if you follow her story along into Mark 6, go from Mark 5 to Mark 6, Jesus goes back into the area of town, into Gennesaret. He goes back into the area of town where he had healed that woman that suffered for 12 years. And then here's what happens. It says, when they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, and they anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus, and they begged him to let them touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. Why were they begging to touch the edge of his cloak? And the reason is because this woman had done it and then runs into town telling her story about how great Jesus is and how amazing her experience with him had been, and all of them wanted it for themselves. And they wanted this specific story. You touch the edge of his cloak, I want to as well. And my point in all of this is just to notice, like, none of them mentioned hell, and it's not that they didn't mention it because it wasn't real. It just, Jesus was good enough news for them. We can talk about that other stuff later, but Jesus is the good news. He's the person that we've encountered. He's the one I want you to meet. He's the one that I can actually, what he's done for me, he's the one that can actually do those things for you. Jesus himself is what they wanted people to know, and it wasn't out of obligation. They never felt like, I need to go share my faith. I got to go do this thing. It's not going to go well. It's going to be real bad. I don't really know what I'm going to say. Like, they didn't do that. Actually, Jesus would tell people consistently, like, hey, I just did something really kind for you. I'd really prefer if you didn't say anything. And it says the more that he told them not to speak, they kept speaking. It's completely opposite in our culture. We've been commanded to go and speak, and we're quiet. They were commanded to be quiet, and they spoke. It's very different. And I think the reason is because they were enlivened with their experience with Jesus. And they weren't trying to start and preach the entire Bible in one setting. They were just like, here's my encounter with him. Here's what happened and changed in my life, and this is available to you as well. Enlivened by their experience, and their story flowed naturally from what they experienced. And eventually it was so compelling to them that everybody heard their stories and were like, yeah, I want that too. If he did that for you, then I want it as well. And I think if we're going to share our faith in a compelling way, this is how we should do it. This is how it's presented when people encountered this man. They didn't talk about something else that they hadn't experienced yet. They talked about the man that they had experienced. Jesus was the good news in their personal encounters with him. And so for you, the question is, where has Jesus been kind to you? Where's he been good to you specifically, personally for you? And if your only good news is he's forgiven my sins and he saved me from hell, that's great. I just promise you there's more of what he wants for you than that. Those things are true for you, and they're available to you. And if you're on your deathbed, those things are the best news that you probably have. My eternity is secure. I'll spend it with my King. But he has so much more for you personally, specifically in your life here and now. Those aren't the only things that he has for you. They are, but there's more available to you. Where has he been good to you? Where have you experienced his kindness in your life? This should be the starting point for our story, a starting point for sharing our faith. For me, some of the stories that I share when I get the opportunity to share them, one is that my parents divorced when I was 3 years old. It was awful. I mean, it was really terrible. I watched my parents argue. I watched them fight. I went through that. As a 3-year-old, I wanted my mom when I had nightmares, and I didn't have her. It was awful. It was miserable. I watched them call the cops on each other. Multiple times. I was used as a pawn between both of them to hurt the other one. Basically just a child, just keep him from her and then keep her from him and all these, like, do all these things just basically to hurt one or the other. I believed everything that my mom said about my dad and everything that my dad said about my mom, and at different points in my life, I hated both of them because I believed what they said and how awful they talked about each other. I believed those things. And we went through this long process of pain, but in the midst of all that pain, my family eventually came to faith. And what God has done in the midst of my family is reconciled everything that we have. They're still separate, but there's forgiveness and there's love and there's kindness and there's patience and there's things that have been redeemed that I thought at 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, and all the way through, there's no way this will ever be good. And I watched him piece this thing back together slowly over time and redeem those things. And actually, it was through my parents' divorce that my mom ended up moving and wound up in Tennessee, and this is where she came to faith. And then one summer, I was visiting my mom, and I met this girl, and I fell in love, and we've been married for 11 years, and we got a 7-year-old. And as painful as that divorce was for so many years, 15 years, of just asking God, please, would you please take this away? Would you please make this better? The pain that it was and how difficult it was, I wouldn't change any of it because my family exists. Not because, oh, good job on the divorce, not because of that, but because God's true to his promise in Romans 8:28. I can work horrible things to good. I can take the most horrendous things that you've ever experienced and I can work them to good. And my literal 3-person family, my wife and my son, are just evidence of the fact that God is actually faithful to that promise. And some of you need to hear that story because you're walking through similar things. And you need to be reminded of the fact that the promise still stands, it's still available to you. These are things, even though it might take 15 years like it did for me to see anything good out of it, this is still available to you. Another story I tell is that I was the least likely to be saved ever in my high school. If there was a superlative, like least likely to be saved in the yearbook, it'd be my face right there. They normally do 2 people. I would have taken both spots. I'm the least likely to be saved. But my mom prayed for me and prayed for me and prayed for me and prayed for me and prayed for me. And one night of drunken debauchery, to the next morning, and wanting nothing to do with Jesus, and the next morning wanting everything to do with Jesus because my heart had been I was still hung over, but all I wanted was more of Jesus and less of me. And one night, everything changed for me because Jesus pursued me that evening when I was the grossest I'd ever been, covered in my own throw up, and he pursued me then and there and changed and just did an impossible thing in my life. I was hanging out with some friends a couple of weeks ago that were there at the party, and they were like, man, you're completely different. After that night, you turned into a completely different person. And I was like, yes, let me tell you the story. Because everything good in my life happens right after that. Everything changed. And some of you have kids or family members or husbands or wives or people in your life that you're like, I just want them to just have this moment where they encounter Jesus and their hearts are changed and all that stuff. And it just seems impossible, and I know what that feels like. People in my high school were like, I never thought that you would ever be a pastor. That's shocking. It's shocking. I'm like, yeah, me too. I don't know. But he does impossible things. Keep praying. Keep praying. And then another story I tell a lot, and we celebrate it every year, is my marriage. There was a day when our relationship, Rainey's and my relationship, was effectively over. And we went to a counselor just to basically say, we had a good run. It was a lot of fun. We're done. That's it. It's not going to work. And 90 minutes later, man, the Lord met us in that counseling room, and there was so much confession and so much repentance. And then we saw what's true of the scriptures that testifies the fact, when you confess your sins one to another, you will be healed. We experienced that happening in the room and our relationship being pieced back together. And we went to that counselor every week for years because it was hard work and we were deeply broken. And it was very, very difficult and really, really painful, but slowly our relationship was pieced back together, piece by piece. And this thing that we thought was too dead to ever live again, Jesus breathed life into it. And some of you are walking through that, in your marriage or in your relationships, you're walking through that, and you need to hear this story. And if somebody were to walk up to you and be like, are you going to go to hell when you die? You'd be like, I don't know, I'm living in hell now in my marriage. I just need somebody to breathe life back into this thing. That's the story we have to tell. Those are the things you have to be reminded of. He does impossible things. Resurrection is what he specializes in. Redemption is what he does. This is what's available, and it's what's possible. And if you want that, he can do that for you. Now, it does take work, especially in marriage. It takes a lot of work. Confessing your sin and repenting and being that vulnerable hurts, and it's hard, and people take advantage of it. But he can do that for you. Those are the stories we have to tell. Yes, Jesus has forgiven my sin. Yes, thank God I can live like a person who no longer fears death because I'm not afraid of hell, because I will live with my King forever. But he has been kind to me. And I want to share those stories, and these are the stories we need to share. Our lives should constantly be shouting what the psalmist said, come and see what God has done, the marvelous works that he has done for mankind. Come and see, just watch me live. Watch my life. Watch what he does in a son of God. Watch what he can do. This is what the man in Mark 5 does. He's like, just come and see what God has done. Look, you know who I was. Look who I am now. Come and see what God has done. And so my question is to you, where have you experienced the goodness of Jesus? Have you experienced this kindness breaking into your story and into your life? I don't think Jesus ever intended for evangelism to be this thing that we feel guilty about. And they'd be like, I don't do that enough. We feel shame about it. I don't think he ever wanted to do that. I think consistently what he's saying to us is like, I just want you to experience life with me. Let me pour out my grace and my kindness in your life. And then from there, just enjoy me publicly. That's what I want you to do. Just enjoy me publicly. Just experience life with me and then enjoy me publicly and let other people see it. And when we do that, I think it's natural for it to come out of our mouths, but it's natural for it to be expressed in our lives. This is what Jesus wants for you as well. So, 3 practical things real quick on how to share that story in a compelling way, whatever that story is for you. 1, live out your good news. Live out your good news. There's a historian that I love, Alan Kreider. It's a great book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. Wonderful book. He talks about the fact that the early church grew primarily not because of stuff like this, not because of worship services, not because of strong programs, and not even because they had a strong evangelism strategy. The way that they grew were the Christians being drastically transformed and just living in that new freedom and new confidence. They felt loved by Jesus, and they lived like people who were loved. So this is what he says. He says, scholars have seen the church's growth as coming about through something modest. Casual contact is what they called it. Contact that would come about in innumerable ways through the networks of family and profession in which most people participated. Masters interacted with slaves, residents met neighbors, and above all, believers networked with relatives and work colleagues. In all of these relationships, effective bonds were formed. The most reliable means of communicating the attractiveness of the faith to others and enticing them to investigate things further was the Christian's character, bearing, and behavior. I love the idea that what he says is like, they weren't like, all right, everybody team on 3 and we're going to go out and hit the doors and evangelize. Like, not that. It was casual contact, just bumping into people and them watching you live. And the Christians had been transformed by Jesus, and they had a new joy, a new love, a new hope, and people just bumped into them, saw that, and they wanted to investigate the claims of their faith and why they lived the way that they did. And that, just how simple and how free that actually is versus this guilt thing that we do where it's like, I got to get out there, I got to do this. Like, not that. Casual contact in relationships that you're currently in. And when they asked him, why are you so different than everybody else? Not because you don't drink, smoke, dance, or whatever. Not that. You're just filled with hope and joy and something else. What is that? It's like, I've been transformed. I've met this man. He can change your life too. Amen. Thank you. The demoniac lived the exact same way. So that's one, just live it. The second is celebrate your good news. This is my favorite. Celebrate your good news. They're all good, but this one's my favorite. Celebrate your good news. Rainey and I do this. I talked about my marriage on that was August 25th, 2010. We celebrate our anniversary August 6th, 2011, but we party hard on August 25th because to us, like, without this day, there is no relationship. Without that, like, the marriage is this day, but, this day for us was this huge, huge thing. And so we celebrate that day, and we throw a party, and we invite friends over, and when they're like, this is a great party, what is this party about? And it's like, oh, let me tell you the story. And when my kid is like, why are we having donuts for dinner? I'm like, let me tell you why, son. Like, Jesus has been kind to us, and he poured out his grace over us, and so eat your fill. Like, eat whatever you want. And we tell the story, and we did it this year, and he was thrilled to eat donuts. I hope he got most of the story, but he was pounding his face with donuts. And to him, like, he has this memory in his life of like this amazing dinner experience, and it's like it's attached to this redemption story of our relationship. And the only reason you exist and are eating donuts here is because this moment exists where Jesus broke in. You need to remember these things and celebrate them. And so wherever Jesus has broken into your story, have a party and invite people over and make it be the best party that you've ever experienced. Have the best food, the best drinks, the best music, whatever you got, and make the best party you've ever experienced. And when they're like, this is the best food I've ever experienced, this is the best drinks, this is the best time I've ever had, why are we here again? It's like, oh, because Jesus has broken into my life with amazing grace, and this is the thing that he did and the kindness that he showed me. And so we throw a party every year, and it's this good because he's this good. That's how we need to express the good. That's a compelling gospel. That's a very compelling way of sharing good news when people are like, this is the best time I've ever had. Why? Because Jesus is at the center of it. That's what we need to do. So celebrate your good news. In the Old Testament, God is constantly telling the people of Israel to party and to celebrate. If you look at all the different times that they were supposed to celebrate how good he was to them in order to show the nations how good he was, they would have been partying for a third of their year. 4 months of their year was supposed to be in celebration. 4 months. We don't party enough as Christians. Sin, Satan, death, hell, all of it crushed, and we're like, yeah, it's okay. We got a little tiny cup in the thing, and I love the communion, but like we need to throw some parties, and invite me if you do. Tim Keller says it, so if you don't believe any of that, Keller says it too. Here we go. Tim Keller says this: God directs his people not to simply worship, but to sing his praises before the nations. We are called not simply to communicate the gospel to non-believers, but we must intentionally celebrate the gospel before them. Celebrate your good news. And last, share. Talk about it. I think this is real. We need to share. I would encourage you to do that primarily in your relationships. I'm not saying you can't be a street evangelist. Lord bless you. Do that thing. But primarily in your relationships, you are called by the Great Commission, by Jesus himself, you are called to make disciples, not converts. Two very different Greek words. Disciples are lifelong relational things, not converts. Getting people to make a decision is not what you're called to do. You're called to walk slowly with people the way that Jesus discipled his disciples. Called to make students, to go slow, primarily in relationships. And you can do that. He says, teach them all the things that I've taught you. You know how long that would take? The idea is that it takes a long time. So in your gospel presentation, when you're sharing your good news, don't feel like I gotta talk about creation, and I gotta talk about eschatology and the end times. I gotta make sure that, we'll work. It's fine. 6 days, 6 generations of time, whatever you think. Here's what Jesus has done. And again, that's what the man born blind does. He's like, I don't know about any of that. All I know is I was blind, but now I see. This is good enough news. We need to do that as well. So primarily in relationships, and then second, when you share it, make sure that you can make your good news specific to the people in your life. I don't know that this is deeply important, but it's just something that you see the Apostle Paul do. When he's preaching to Jewish people, he talks a lot about the Old Testament in Acts 13, and he's like helping them see how Jesus is the promised Messiah. But then he talks to Gentiles who know nothing of the Old Testament, and he mentions the Old Testament 0. He doesn't talk about it ever. What he talks about actually with the Gentiles are like, hey, Jesus has made God known and you can know him as well, because that's what they cared about. That was good news to them. Good news to the Jews was the Messiah, the promised Messiah has come. To the Gentiles, we can know this God that we have all these statues about, but we're not totally sure who he is. And he just tilts his good news. The good news of Jesus is broad. It's not just about hell. It's not just about heaven. It's not just about sins forgiven. Those things are true. But the good news is so broad that he mentions this good news to the Jewish people and this good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. And his good news is always about Jesus himself, because to him, Jesus was enough. And so for us, what in your story has Jesus done that would be good news to other people in your life? What specifically is like they're dealing with exactly what I dealt with? They need to hear the story of kindness where Jesus has had mercy on me, where he showed me kindness. In closing, I just want you to understand that evangelism was never supposed to be this guilt trip thing. It was never supposed to be this thing that you were like, I just need to. It's not that. It's not get to work. It's just experience Jesus for yourself. Enjoy me publicly. Just walk with me and let me break into your life with amazing grace consistently. Experience the goodness of God and then enjoy me out loud. I promise people will respond. That is the most compelling way. That if you want to share your faith, if you want people in your life to do it, it might take time, and for me it took 18 years. But enjoy Jesus yourself, and you will do that publicly, and people will be like, I just want the same joy. So that's my encouragement to you. Where have you experienced the goodness of God in your life? Let the world see it by enjoying it publicly. Let me pray. Father, your kindness and your mercy towards your sons and your daughters is extravagant. And our lives do, in fact, testify to the fact that we could say, come and see the marvelous works of the Lord. Come and see what he has done for me. God, there are people in our lives, there are Christians in this room that needed to be reminded of the marvelous works of the Lord. And there are people in our lives that are desperate to experience those things. God, would you help us to remember where you've been kind to us? Would you help us to continue in our journey and our faith with you, asking and seeing these spaces where you break in with incredible mercy and incredible kindness, and allow those things to be things that we enjoy, that other people eventually get to enjoy as well. Lord, would you help us and give us boldness and opportunity to just share exactly what the man in Mark 5 did, just the mercy of God, that you've had in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.